My best friend panicked. My parents are forcing me to go on a date, but I already have a boyfriend. What if you go on the date for me? I laughed, thinking she was kidding until Joyce handed over 3 crisp $100 bills. Pretend to be me. Act completely insane. Talk about your ex-boyfriends. Maybe eat with your hands. Mention you collect dead butterflies. Whatever it takes to make sure the guy runs away. I blinked at her quietly. She reached out and held my hand. Look, I just started dating Corey. I really like him, and I can't mess it up being seen with another guy. So please, just one dinner? I looked at her and at the $400 that would seriously help with my pet's vet bills and agreed. Just one dinner and I'd never have to see the guy's face again. I showed up to the restaurant looking like Shrek's long-lost sibling, wearing a neon green dress that barely covered anything and enough makeup to paint a house. The hostess raised an eyebrow but led me to Ralph's table. He stood up, professional in his navy suit, and his eyes widened slightly. Joyce? That's me, handsome, I instantly flirted, already feeling ridiculous. I sat down without waiting for him to pull out my chair. You're Ralphie, right? Ralph, actually. I prefer Ralphie, I said rudely. I reached out and grabbed a breadstick from the basket with my fist and proceeded to eat and talk about traffic at the same time. Crumbs flew out of my mouth onto the table. He watched me demolish the breadstick, but somehow his eyes were more full of life. Just then, a waiter walked over to collect our orders. Ralph ordered something simple while I went with the juicy, expensive lobster. When our food arrived, I proceeded to eat the lobster with my hands, butter dripping down my arms. I hoped it was enough to send him running out. But something weird happened. Instead of looking horrified, Ralph started laughing. When I sucked on a lobster claw like a caveman, he picked up his own pasta with his hands. When in Rome, he said, twirling spaghetti around his fingers. By the time dessert arrived, we were both crying from laughter from trying to eat ice cream with our bare hands. While we walked out to his car, he reached over and held my cold hands in his, putting it up to his lips to puff warm air on it. I couldn't help but blush at the romantic gesture. Can I be honest about something? This was the most fun I've had in months, and I'd really like to see you again, he said softly. I almost said yes, but then I remembered. I was pretending to be Joyce. I don't think that's a good idea, I told him weakly. His eyes met mine, as if those beautiful green eyeballs could change my mind. One more date. I promise I'll use a fork this time, he grinned. Unless you don't want me to. My heart raced. I was done for. I drove straight to Joyce's apartment that night, panicking. He wants another date. The color drained from her face. What do you mean he wants another date? What did you do? I literally did everything wrong. And for some reason, he just liked it. Joyce paced her living room. This can't be happening. My parents will expect me to bring him to the country club dinner next week. She pulled out her phone and Venmo'd me another $300. The second date is Thursday. Be worse. Be so much worse. That Thursday, Ralph picked me up for bowling. This time, I chose a sparkly sequined jumpsuit that made me look like a walking disco ball. I threw gutter balls on purpose, making awful poses each time. I pretended to cry each time a single pin got knocked down. But Ralph just rolled with it. He came up behind me to teach me proper form patiently, placing his hands on my arm gently. When I threw another gutter ball, he cheered like I'd won the Olympics. You're consistent. That takes skill, he joked. And honestly, it was starting to get to me. Nothing I did ever fazed him. And I realized, a guy as great as this only came once in a blue moon. Once we were done bowling, we sat in the worn plastic chairs sharing nachos, watching others play. You know what I like about you? He said. You're not trying to impress anyone. Everyone I meet is so concerned with appearing perfect. You just exist. I mean, 2 dates in, and I'm already excited about the next one. You're confident, unapologetic, and beautiful. I knew this was spiraling completely out of control, but when he kissed me goodnight, soft and respectful and perfect, I kissed him back. I'll see you Saturday. Wait, Saturday? I opened my phone and saw 30 missed calls from Joyce. Dude, what the heck? He called my parents. They set up dinner at the country club thinking that I'm the one going on those dates. What are we going to do? Joyce rambled, feeling just as scared as I did. Maybe we can just tell the truth? Over my dead body, Joyce snapped. So she went on the date, and when Ralph saw her walk in, he stared at her completely speechless. Joyce tried to play it cool. Ralph! So good to see you again. Excuse us for just a moment, she said, grabbing his arm. Let me explain, she whispered. After a few minutes, Ralph burst into laughter. He searched the room and quickly found me through my disguise. He walked over and grinned. You've got a thing for disguises. But just as things started to settle quietly, Joyce's phone buzzed. She looked at it and all the color drained from her face again. Oh God. What? I asked. She showed me her phone, a text from her boyfriend Corey with a photo attached. I stared at the screen and my whole body went cold when I saw the picture. There I was in that sparkly jumpsuit, kissing Ralph outside the bowling alley, and the angle made it super clear this wasn't some random snapshot. Corey's message underneath just said, "Care to explain who this is?" And I knew right then that everything was about to blow up in our faces. Joyce grabbed the phone back from me and started making these weird gasping sounds like she couldn't get enough air. She walked in circles around the country club table while other diners stared at us, and I tried to figure out how Corey even got this photo in the first place. Ralph stood there looking confused, probably wondering why Joyce suddenly seemed like she was having a panic attack, when 2 seconds ago she'd been laughing about the whole disguise situation. I pulled Joyce aside toward the bathroom hallway where fewer people could see us freaking out. She leaned against the wall and finally managed to say that one of Corey's friends had been at the bowling alley that night. Apparently, the friend recognized the neon sequined jumpsuit from Joyce's Instagram posts and took the photo thinking it was her. Joyce explained all this while tears started running down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. I told her we needed to come clean right now before this got any worse, that we should just tell everyone the truth and deal with whatever happened. She looked at me like I'd suggested we burn down the building. Joyce said absolutely not. She would handle Corey herself and I needed to leave so she could think. She literally put her hands on my shoulders and started pushing me toward the exit while Ralph watched the whole thing looking totally lost. I grabbed my purse and walked out to my car feeling like I might throw up in the parking lot. That night, I lay in bed staring at my ceiling and couldn't sleep at all. My cat Muffin was curled up next to me, but she felt way too warm and barely moved when I pet her. The money Joyce had paid me was sitting in my bank account, but now it felt dirty somehow, like I'd stolen it instead of earned it. I kept thinking about Ralph's face when he kissed me goodnight, how sweet and genuine he'd been, and how I was lying to him about literally everything. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from Ralph asking what my plans were for the weekend. I stared at that message for at least 20 minutes trying to figure out what to say. Finally, I just typed back something vague about maybe being free and needing to check my schedule. He sent back a smiley face and said no pressure. Just let him know. I put my phone face down on my nightstand because I couldn't look at it anymore. Muffin made this sad little meowing sound, and I noticed she hadn't touched her food bowl all day. I tried to give her some treats, but she just sniffed them and walked away slowly. The guilt about everything mixed with worry about my cat made me feel awful in a way I couldn't really describe. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 7, and I saw it was Joyce. I almost didn't answer, but figured I should probably deal with whatever new disaster had happened. When I picked up, she was already crying, so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Eventually, I figured out that Corey had come over to her apartment last night and confronted her about the photo. Joyce said she'd broken down and admitted to paying someone to impersonate her on dates with Ralph. She kept saying Corey was so mad, not just about the dates, but about her lying to him over and over again. Apparently, Corey had given her an ultimatum that she needed to tell Ralph the truth herself, or he would do it for her. Joyce was sobbing into the phone saying she couldn't tell Ralph, that it would ruin everything with him and her parents would find out. I sat there in bed listening to her panic while Muffin barely moved next to me. Joyce begged me to help her come up with some story that would make this whole thing look less bad. Maybe we could say it was just the first date as a joke, or that I was her cousin doing her a favor, or literally anything besides the truth. I felt this weird calm come over me and I told her no. I said I was done lying and that we'd created this mess by not being honest from the start. Joyce got quiet for a second and then her voice changed to angry. She said I was being selfish and didn't care about anyone but myself. I told her that wasn't true, but I couldn't keep doing this. And then she hung up on me. I looked at Muffin and she was barely moving at all. Her breathing seemed weird and shallow, and when I picked her up, she felt like a hot water bottle. I threw on clothes and drove straight to the emergency vet clinic, holding Muffin wrapped in a towel on the passenger seat. The receptionist took one look at her and brought us right back to an exam room. Eli came in a few minutes later and his face got all serious when he started examining Muffin. He asked me questions about her symptoms while he checked her temperature and felt her stomach. Then he said she needed some tests right away, and possibly surgery depending on what they found. I asked how much it would cost, and Eli looked uncomfortable. He said the tests alone would be around $500, and if she needed surgery, we were looking at close to $3,000 total. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach because even with Joyce's money, I didn't have that kind of cash. Eli must have seen my face because he said they'd run the tests first and figure out payment options after. A vet tech came and took Muffin to the back while I sat there trying not to cry in the exam room. The waiting room had this big fish tank against one wall, and I sat there watching the fish swim in circles. My phone buzzed and I saw Ralph had texted asking if I was free for dinner at his place this weekend. He said he'd cook something nice and we could watch a movie after. The message was so sweet and normal compared to the total mess my life had become. I wanted to text back yes so badly, to pretend everything was fine and just enjoy being with him. But I knew I'd be sitting at his dinner table lying about who I even was. I stared at that fish tank and felt tears starting to come, because this genuinely good person wanted to spend time with me, and I was basically a fraud. A little kid sitting near me asked his mom why the lady was crying at the fish. His mom shushed him and they moved to different seats. I wiped my face and tried to pull myself together, but everything felt like it was falling apart at once. Eli came back out after what felt like forever holding a folder with test results. He sat down next to me instead of making me come back to the exam room, which I appreciated. He explained that Muffin had some kind of infection that needed surgery to fix, but not immediately. We had maybe 2 weeks before it became really serious. Eli said the surgery would cost around $3,000, but they had payment plans available. He could do the surgery for $1,000 down, and I could pay the rest over 6 months. His voice was really kind when he said he could tell I was stressed about more than just my cat. I thanked him and said I'd figure out the down payment somehow. He gave me some medicine for Muffin to take home and said to bring her back in a week for a checkup. When I stood up to leave, Eli touched my arm gently and said it would work out. I almost started crying again but managed to hold it together until I got to my car. I drove home with Muffin in her carrier next to me, and when I pulled into my apartment complex, I saw Joyce sitting on the steps outside my building. She looked absolutely terrible, like she hadn't slept at all. Her hair was messy, and she was wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt instead of her usual perfect outfits. I got out of the car with Muffin's carrier, and Joyce stood up. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She said Corey had given her until tomorrow to tell Ralph the truth or he was going to do it himself. Now Joyce was panicking because her parents would find out, and they'd already invited Ralph to some family brunch at the country club this Sunday. She said if this whole thing exploded before the brunch, her parents would be humiliated in front of all their friends. I set Muffin's carrier down on the steps and looked at Joyce. I told her that her parents being embarrassed was way less important than the fact that we'd been lying to Ralph this whole time. Joyce started crying again and said I didn't understand how bad this would be for her. She reached for her phone and said she was going to Venmo me another $500 if I'd just do one more appearance at the brunch, and then we'd figure out how to end things cleanly. I picked up Muffin's carrier and told Joyce absolutely not. I said I was going to tell Ralph the truth myself before Corey did it, and she needed to deal with her parents on her own. Joyce's face changed from sad to angry, and she said I was ruining her life. I walked past her into my building and didn't look back even though I could hear her crying on the steps outside. Inside my apartment, I set Muffin's carrier down and looked at Joyce standing in my doorway. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and took a shaky breath before starting to explain. Her parents had already invited Ralph to some big family brunch at the country club this Sunday. They were planning to introduce him to all their friends and business partners. If this whole thing came out before then, her mom and dad would look like complete idiots in front of everyone they knew. I interrupted her and said their embarrassment mattered way less than the fact that we'd been lying to Ralph this whole time. Joyce's face changed and she pulled out her phone again. She opened her payment app and started typing. $500 appeared on my screen with a message asking me to do just one more appearance at the brunch. After that, we'd figure out how to end things the right way. I picked up Muffin's carrier and told Joyce absolutely not. I was done lying and I was going to tell Ralph the truth myself before Corey did it for me. She needed to deal with her parents on her own. Joyce's expression went from sad to really angry in about 2 seconds. She said I was completely ruining her life and didn't understand how bad this would be. I walked past her into my building and shut the door. I could still hear her crying outside on the steps, but I didn't go back. Inside my apartment, I sat down at my kitchen table with a notebook and tried to write out what I'd say to Ralph. Every version sounded worse than the last one. Sorry I pretended to be your date because I needed money for my sick cat didn't exactly roll off the tongue. I tried different approaches like starting with an apology or leading with the truth about Joyce or explaining my vet bills first. Nothing worked. After filling up 3 pages with crossed-out attempts, I started saying the words out loud to practice. Muffin sat on the couch watching me pace around talking to myself. I explained to her that I'd been paid to act crazy on purpose, but then I actually started liking the guy. She just blinked at me slowly like I was the biggest moron she'd ever seen. I tried again with a different opening about how the situation got out of control. Muffin yawned and turned away. Even my cat thought I was hopeless. My phone buzzed on the table and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Ralph's name appeared on the screen asking if everything was okay because I'd been really quiet lately. His message was so nice and concerned that I felt even worse than before. I typed out a response saying I was fine and then deleted it. I tried writing that I missed him, but that felt wrong too. After about 15 attempts that all sounded terrible, I finally just typed that I needed to talk to him about something important. I hit send before I could change my mind again. His response came back in less than a minute. He offered to come over to my place or meet me somewhere else, whatever would make me most comfortable. He said he was free whenever I needed to talk. Reading his kind words felt like someone was stabbing me in the chest. I suggested meeting at a quiet coffee shop tomorrow afternoon around 3. He texted back right away saying he'd be there and asking if I was sure everything was all right. I told him we'd talk tomorrow and then put my phone face down on the table so I wouldn't keep staring at it. That night, I laid in bed staring at my ceiling and couldn't fall asleep at all. My brain kept playing out different versions of how Ralph might react when I told him everything. Maybe he'd get really angry and yell at me in the coffee shop. Maybe he'd just stand up and walk out without saying anything. Maybe he'd look at me with that disappointed expression that's somehow worse than anger. I kept remembering what he said on our second date about how everyone he meets tries so hard to seem perfect. He told me he liked that I wasn't trying to impress anyone and just existed as myself. Except I wasn't being myself at all. I was literally being paid to act like someone else. I was exactly the kind of fake performative person he'd been trying to avoid. The irony of it made me feel sick. Around 2 in the morning, my phone lit up with a text from Joyce. She was begging me not to tell Ralph yet because she needed time to prepare her parents first. She said if I could just wait a few more days, she'd figure out how to break it to them gently. I read the message and didn't respond. I was completely done letting Joyce control this situation. I needed to do the right thing no matter what timeline worked best for her family's social calendar. I turned my phone to silent and rolled over to try to sleep. The next morning, Corey texted asking if we could meet at a diner before I talked to Ralph. I agreed because I figured I owed him that much after the whole mess. He was already sitting in a booth when I arrived, drinking coffee and looking surprisingly calm. I sat down across from him and waited for him to start yelling. Instead, he just said he wasn't trying to blow up everyone's life. He couldn't keep watching Joyce lie to people who didn't deserve it. His voice was steady and reasonable, which somehow made me feel worse. Corey told me he actually felt bad for Ralph based on everything he'd heard. The guy sounded really decent and didn't deserve to be played like this. Then Corey looked at me and said I had until 5 o'clock today to tell Ralph the truth. After that, he was going to reach out to Ralph himself. That felt fair even though the deadline made my stomach hurt. I thanked him for giving me the chance to do it myself. He nodded and said he hoped everything worked out. We sat there for another minute in awkward silence before I left to go home and change clothes. I showed up at the coffee shop 30 minutes before 3 o'clock because I was too nervous to wait at home anymore. I ordered a latte and sat down at a corner table. Then I got back up and ordered a cappuccino because I needed something to do with my hands. 5 minutes later, I went back to the counter and got an iced coffee too. The barista gave me a weird look but didn't say anything. I sat at my table surrounded by 3 different drinks, watching the door and feeling like I might throw up. At exactly 3 o'clock, Ralph walked in wearing jeans and a blue sweater. He smiled when he saw me, and that warm, friendly expression made me feel like the absolute worst person who ever lived. Ralph walked over to my corner table and his smile faded when he got close enough to see my face. He sat down across from me and reached across the table to take my hand. I pulled back gently before he could touch me. My hands were shaking, so bad I had to put them in my lap. Ralph's face shifted from friendly to concerned in about 2 seconds. He leaned forward slightly and asked what was wrong. I took a breath and told him I needed to explain something from the beginning. The whole beginning. His eyebrows pulled together and he nodded slowly, waiting for me to continue. I started talking, and once I started, I couldn't stop. I told him about Joyce paying me $400 to pretend to be her on a date. I explained about my cat needing surgery and the vet bills I couldn't afford. I admitted that every single thing about our dates was supposed to be fake, that I was supposed to act crazy enough to make him run away. I described how nothing I did worked because he just kept being kind and patient and genuinely interested. I confessed that somewhere between the lobster dinner and the bowling alley, I stopped pretending and my feelings became real. Ralph's face went through about 10 different emotions while I talked. His eyes got wider when I mentioned Joyce. His jaw tightened when I said the word fake. Something that looked like hurt flashed across his face when I explained about being paid. When I finally stopped talking, he just sat there completely silent. I watched him process everything and wanted to disappear into the floor. The coffee shop sound seemed way too loud. Someone's phone rang 3 tables over and I jumped. Ralph kept staring at the table between us like he was trying to make sense of a puzzle that didn't fit together. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 2 minutes, he looked up at me. His voice came out quiet when he asked if anything about our time together was real. I told him honestly that my feelings became real even though the situation wasn't. I said I understood completely if he never wanted to see me again. I meant it too. Ralph nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. He just stood up without any warning and walked toward the door. I sat there frozen, not knowing if I should follow him or give him space. Through the big front window, I watched him pace back and forth on the sidewalk. He ran his hands through his hair over and over. His shoulders looked tense even from inside. A couple walking past him had to step around him. I gripped the edge of the table and made myself stay in my chair, even though every part of me wanted to go out there. 5 minutes passed with him pacing outside. Finally, he pulled open the door and walked back to our table. He sat down again and his whole body language was different now. Closed off. His voice was calm, but I could hear the hurt underneath when he said he needed time to process this. He asked me to please not contact him while he figured out how he feels. Then he stood up again and left without looking back at me. I watched him walk to his car through the window. He got in and drove away, and I just sat there staring at the empty parking spot. The tears started about 30 seconds after his car disappeared. I put my head down on the table and cried for 20 minutes straight. The barista came over eventually and gently asked if I was okay. I lifted my head and wiped my face with a napkin and told her I would be. She gave me a sad smile and went back behind the counter. I pulled out my phone and texted Corey that I told Ralph everything. He responded pretty fast, saying he respected that I did the right thing. I gathered up my 3 barely touched drinks and dumped them in the trash on my way out. My phone started ringing before I even got to my car. Joyce's name flashed on the screen and I almost didn't answer. I picked up and she immediately started screaming. Ralph had just called her parents and canceled the brunch saying something came up. Now her mother was suspicious and asking questions. Joyce wanted to know what I said to him. I told her she needed to tell her parents the truth herself because I was done being part of this lie. She tried to argue, but I hung up on her. I drove home in silence and went straight to bed even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. That evening my phone rang again, and this time it was Eli from the vet clinic. He said he could start my cat's surgery prep this week if I could put down $1,000. He'd worked out a payment plan for the rest of the bill. I sat up in bed and told him I'd bring the deposit tomorrow. At least the money Joyce paid me could go towards something good now. I felt slightly less guilty about accepting it. The next morning, Joyce sent me a long text. She'd told her parents a watered-down version of what happened. She said she asked a friend to meet Ralph once as a favor, and things got complicated. Her parents were confused, but not as angry as she expected. Then she added that Corey broke up with her anyway. Part of me felt bad for her, but mostly I was just completely exhausted. I texted back a simple okay and left it at that. The next 3 days I spent helping at Eli's clinic doing basic tasks. I cleaned cages and organized files and helped feed the animals. Eli seemed grateful for the extra hands and said it would work off part of my bill. The routine of caring for animals helped distract me from constantly checking my phone. Every time it buzzed, I hoped it might be Ralph. It never was. I kept my hands busy with work and tried not to think about his hurt face across that coffee shop table. My cat was scheduled for surgery at the end of the week, and at least I could focus on that. At least I could do something right. The morning of the surgery, I showed up at the clinic an hour early and helped Eli prep the operating room even though my hands were shaking the whole time. He walked me through what would happen and let me stay in the room during the procedure, which probably broke some rules, but he could tell I needed to see it. I watched him work with steady hands while my cat lay there under anesthesia looking so small and fragile on the metal table. The surgery took 2 hours, and I spent most of it standing in the corner trying not to cry or throw up. When Eli finally looked up and pulled his mask down, he was smiling. He told me everything went better than expected, and the prognosis was really good with proper care and medication. I actually hugged him right there in the operating room, and he laughed and patted my back awkwardly. While we were cleaning up after, Eli mentioned I had good instincts with the animals and asked if I'd ever thought about veterinary work as a career. I admitted I'd never really considered it before, but working at the clinic these past few days had been the only thing keeping me sane. He said he could tell I had a natural way with the animals, and that mattered more than people realized in this field. My cat woke up groggy and confused but alive, and I sat with her in the recovery kennel for 3 hours just watching her breathe. 7 days passed without any word from Ralph, and I tried not to check my phone every 5 minutes but failed completely. I was at the clinic organizing medication supplies when my phone buzzed and his name appeared on the screen. My hands started shaking so bad I almost dropped a bottle of antibiotics. The text asked if we could talk again, and my chest felt like it might explode. I stared at those words for probably 10 minutes before typing back that I was willing to meet whenever he wanted. He suggested a park near downtown the next day around 2 in the afternoon, somewhere neutral and open. I agreed and spent the rest of my shift completely unable to focus on anything. That night, I tried on 6 different outfits before settling on jeans and a plain sweater because I wanted to look like myself, not like I was trying too hard. I barely slept and showed up at the park 20 minutes early, sitting on a bench near the playground where I could see him coming. Ralph walked up right at 2 wearing casual clothes instead of his usual professional look, and he sat down on the bench leaving about 2 feet of space between us. He started by saying he'd spent the week processing everything and talking to friends about what happened. His voice was calm, but I could hear the hurt underneath it. He said he understood I was in a desperate situation with my cat's medical bills, but he still felt confused and betrayed. Then he asked why I didn't just tell him the truth after the first date when things started getting complicated. I watched a kid on the swings while I tried to figure out how to answer that question honestly. I told him I was scared of losing the money Joyce paid me because I genuinely needed it for my cat. Then later I was scared of losing him because somewhere between the lobster dinner and the bowling alley I'd started developing real feelings. I admitted that neither excuse justified lying to him over and over, and I knew that now. Ralph nodded slowly and said he appreciated my honesty, even though he wished it had come weeks ago. A woman walked by with 3 dogs on leashes, and we both watched them pass in silence. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and told me about a past relationship from a few years ago. The woman he dated pretended to be interested in all his hobbies and values just to keep him around. She went to his company events and acted like she cared about his work and laughed at all his jokes. Then 6 months in, she admitted she'd been faking most of it because she thought that's what he wanted. Ralph said when the truth came out, he felt like he'd been dating a complete stranger the entire time. He looked at me directly and said this situation with Joyce and the fake dates brought back all those feelings of being manipulated and not knowing what was real. I understood why he felt that way, and I didn't blame him for it. A group of teenagers walked past us arguing about something, and their voices faded as they moved toward the basketball courts. I apologized again and told him I completely understood if he couldn't forgive me for what I did. But I wanted him to know that my enjoyment of our time together was genuine, even if the circumstances weren't. The laughter during those ridiculous dates was real, and my feelings were real even though everything else was fake. Ralph turned to look at me and admitted he felt a real connection too during those dates. He said that's exactly why this hurt so much, because the connection felt authentic, and finding out it was built on lies made him question everything. We sat there not talking while a dad pushed his daughter on the swings nearby. The little girl was laughing and asking to go higher, and the sound felt strange against the heavy conversation we were having. After maybe 10 minutes of silence, Ralph said he needed more time to process everything, but he wasn't completely ruling out the possibility of starting over eventually. He emphasized it would have to be totally honest from the beginning, like meeting for the first time as our actual selves with no pretending. I told him that if he ever wanted to try that, I was willing, but I wouldn't pressure him or sit around expecting it to happen. Ralph seemed relieved by my response and said he'd reach out when and if he felt ready. We stood up at the same time, and there was this awkward moment where neither of us knew if we should hug or shake hands or just walk away. He ended up giving me a small wave and heading toward the parking lot while I stayed on the bench for another 20 minutes. The next 2 weeks, I threw myself into taking care of my cat and working at the clinic. My cat's recovery went smoothly, and she started acting more like herself, demanding food and attention at all hours. I showed up at the clinic every day, even when Eli didn't specifically need me, organizing supplies and cleaning cages and helping with basic animal care tasks. Eli noticed how much time I was spending there and officially offered me a part-time job helping with the animals. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was steady, and it came with the benefit of discounted vet care. Having that structure and purpose helped me feel less like my entire life was falling apart. I learned how to properly restrain cats for examinations, and how to read basic lab results and which medications needed refrigeration. Eli was patient when I made mistakes and seemed genuinely happy to have the extra help. On a Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Joyce asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost ignored it, but then I read the full message where she apologized for dragging me into her mess. She said she'd been in therapy for the past 2 weeks talking about why she felt the need to lie instead of just being honest with Corey from the start. I agreed to meet her the next day at a coffee shop near my apartment. When I walked in, she was already sitting at a corner table looking nervous. We ordered our drinks and sat down and had probably the most real conversation we'd ever had about our friendship. Joyce admitted she'd always been afraid of disappointing people, so she'd gotten really good at telling people what they wanted to hear. She said her therapist was helping her understand that pattern and work on being more authentic. I told her I appreciated the apology and I understood the pressure she felt from her parents and Corey. We talked about boundaries and how we both needed to be better at being honest with each other going forward. By the end of the conversation, things felt different between us. Not fixed completely, but definitely more genuine than before. I told Joyce I appreciated everything and I really did forgive her, but I needed some space to work through my own feelings about the whole situation. She nodded and wiped her eyes with a napkin, saying she completely understood and wouldn't push me to hang out until I was ready. Then she mentioned something that surprised me, that she'd actually sat down with her parents last week and told them the full truth about paying me to impersonate her on those dates with Ralph. I asked how they reacted and she said they were disappointed at first, mostly about the lying. But after a few days, her mom called and said she was proud Joyce had been honest eventually. Her dad apparently made some joke about it being the most expensive dating disaster in family history, which helped break the tension. We finished our coffee and hugged goodbye in the parking lot, and it felt different from our usual hugs. More real somehow. I drove home feeling lighter, like I'd finally dealt with something I'd been avoiding. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was cleaning out my cat's litter box, and I nearly dropped the scoop when I saw Corey's name on the screen. His text was simple, just asking how I was doing and if my cat was okay. I wiped my hands and sat down on my bathroom floor to respond, telling him honestly that things were complicated but getting better. We ended up texting back and forth for almost an hour about the whole mess, and he was surprisingly cool about everything. He said he and Joyce had been talking again as friends, working through their own stuff, and he thought they might actually be better off this way. Then he wrote something that made me tear up a little, that he hoped things worked out with Ralph eventually, because anyone could tell my feelings for him were genuine. I thanked him for being understanding when he had every right to be angry at both of us. He sent back a shrugging emoji and said life was too short to hold grudges over complicated situations. My cat's recovery happened faster than Eli expected, and within 2 weeks she was back to her normal self, demanding food at weird hours and knocking things off my dresser for fun. I brought her in for a follow-up appointment and Eli examined her thoroughly, checking all her vitals and the surgery site. He declared her the clinic's biggest success story of the month, which made me laugh because she was currently trying to bite the thermometer. Watching her act like her usual demanding self reminded me why I'd agreed to Joyce's crazy plan in the first place, why I'd been willing to look ridiculous and lie to a stranger. She headbutted my hand while Eli printed out her discharge papers, and I scratched behind her ears feeling grateful she was healthy. Eli mentioned I'd been doing great work at the clinic and asked if I wanted to pick up more hours, and I agreed immediately because the routine had been helping me stay focused. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and taking care of my cat, and trying not to check my phone every 5 minutes hoping Ralph might text. I helped Eli with everything from filing paperwork to holding dogs still for their shots, and the physical work kept my mind busy. 3 weeks after our park conversation, I was restocking supplies in the back room when my phone buzzed. Ralph's name appeared on the screen and my hands started shaking so bad I almost dropped a box of syringes. His message asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, just as ourselves with no pretense or games. I typed yes immediately, then spent the next 2 hours after work tearing through my closet trying to figure out what to wear before I realized how ridiculous I was being. He'd already seen me in a neon green dress eating lobster with my hands and a sparkly jumpsuit throwing gutter balls, so normal clothes should be fine. We agreed to meet at a different coffee shop across town, somewhere neither of us had been before. I got there early again out of nervousness and ordered a regular coffee. No fancy drinks this time. Ralph walked in exactly on time wearing jeans and a casual button-down, and we both kind of stood there awkwardly for a second before sitting down. The conversation felt stiff at first, both of us careful with our words, until Ralph made a joke about being relieved I'd brought my own fork this time. We both cracked up and the tension broke, and suddenly it felt easier to talk. He asked about my cat right away, and seemed genuinely happy when I told him about her full recovery and how she was back to being a pain. I asked about his work, and he told me about a difficult client he'd been dealing with, and it felt nice to just have a normal conversation. Ralph leaned back in his chair and said he'd been doing a lot of thinking about what being real actually meant. He explained that most people he met through work or dating apps were so focused on showing their best side that it felt fake, like everyone was performing instead of existing. Then he said something that caught me off guard, that my willingness to look completely ridiculous on those dates was actually more genuine than the polished versions of people he usually encountered. I pointed out that I was literally being paid to act insane, which wasn't exactly authentic. He grinned and said even so, I'd committed fully to the bit, and there was something honest about that level of commitment, even if the situation itself was dishonest. We debated this back and forth, half joking and half serious, and I realized I'd missed talking to him like this. Our conversation stretched into 2 full hours as we talked about our actual lives without any pretense. Ralph told me about growing up with 2 older sisters who never let him get away with anything, and how that shaped his appreciation for people who called him out. I shared stories about working at the clinic and how I was thinking about maybe pursuing veterinary medicine more seriously. He admitted he was still processing the hurt from everything that happened, but he could see now how the situation had grown beyond what I'd originally intended. I explained that I'd felt trapped between needing the money and developing real feelings, and how guilty I'd felt the whole time. Ralph nodded and said he understood desperation, that he'd made questionable choices in the past when he felt backed into a corner. We talked about past relationships and what we were both looking for, and it felt like we were finally meeting each other for real. As we walked out to the parking lot, Ralph stopped next to my car and asked if I'd be interested in trying an actual first date sometime, with both of us being completely ourselves. I wanted to say yes immediately, but I made myself ask if he was genuinely ready for that or just forcing it. He promised he wouldn't have asked unless he was sure, that the last 3 weeks of thinking had helped him work through his feelings. I said yes, but told him to take as much time as he needed, that I didn't want to rush into something if he still had doubts. Ralph smiled and said he appreciated that, and we stood there for another minute just looking at each other before he gave me a quick hug and headed to his car. 2 days later, I was helping Eli organize the medication cabinet when my phone buzzed with a text from Ralph. He asked if I was free Saturday evening for dinner at a normal restaurant where we'd both use utensils properly. I laughed out loud, which made Eli look over with a raised eyebrow, and I quickly typed back that I'd love to. The rest of the week dragged by slowly as I worked and took care of my cat and tried not to overthink everything. Saturday finally arrived and I put on a simple dress, nothing too fancy or too casual, and drove to the restaurant Ralph had picked. He was already waiting outside when I pulled up, and seeing him standing there in nice pants and a sweater made my stomach flip. Our actual first date was wonderfully boring in the best possible way. Just 2 people having dinner and talking about real things. Ralph told me about his job in financial consulting, explaining what he actually did in terms I could understand, and I shared stories about working at the clinic and the weird things people's pets did. We talked about our families, our friends, what we wanted out of life, and it all felt natural and honest. He asked about my plans for school and seemed genuinely interested when I explained the vet tech program I was looking into. I asked about his hobbies and learned he played guitar badly and liked hiking, and we made plans to maybe go on a trail together sometime. The food was good, we both used forks the entire time, and when Ralph walked me to my car at the end of the night, everything felt right in a way it hadn't before. We walked out to the parking lot and the cold air hit my face after being inside the warm restaurant for 2 hours. Ralph walked beside me quietly until we reached my car, and then he stopped and turned to face me directly. He reached out and took my hand gently and asked if he could kiss me. I nodded because words felt stuck in my throat, and he leaned in slowly, giving me time to change my mind. The kiss was soft and careful, like we were both trying to be gentle with something new, but also remembering everything that came before. When we pulled apart, he smiled and squeezed my hand once before stepping back. I got in my car and drove home feeling like maybe this could actually work if we both kept being honest. Over the next month, Ralph and I went on actual dates where we both acted like ourselves and talked about real things. We went to a museum and he told me about his favorite paintings while I pretended to understand art. We got pizza and sat in his car talking for 3 hours about our families and what we wanted from life. One night we went back to that same bowling alley, and this time I actually tried to play properly and still got mostly gutter balls. Ralph laughed and said at least now he knew it wasn't an act, and I threw a piece of popcorn at his head. We talked about the lobster dinner sometimes, and the ridiculous jumpsuit and how weird it was that all that chaos led to something real. Every date felt easy and comfortable because we weren't trying to impress each other or hide anything. Ralph would text me good morning and ask about my day at the clinic and remember small details I mentioned. I found myself looking forward to seeing him in a way that felt different from the panic of those first fake dates. Joyce called me one afternoon while I was organizing supplies at the clinic and told me she met someone new at her therapy group. She sounded different when she talked about him, more careful and honest about who she was. She said she told him about the whole Ralph situation on their second date because she wanted to start things off right this time. I asked how he reacted, and she said he appreciated her honesty, even though the story was completely insane. We met for coffee a week later, and she looked better than I'd seen her in months. She apologized again for dragging me into her mess, and said therapy was helping her understand why she felt the need to lie, instead of just dealing with things directly. I told her I forgave her and that I was glad she was working on herself. We agreed to rebuild our friendship slowly with better boundaries and more honesty than before. Eli called me into his office one morning and said he wanted to offer me a more official position at the clinic with actual pay, instead of just working off my bill. He said I was good with the animals and picked things up quickly and he could use the help. I accepted immediately because the money would help, and also because I genuinely enjoyed the work. While I was cleaning cages later that day, I realized I might actually want to pursue this as a real career. I mentioned it to Ralph that night over dinner and his face lit up. He started pulling up veterinary technician programs on his phone and asking questions about what I'd need to do. He offered to help me study for entrance exams and said he was good at making study guides. The way he got excited about my potential future made me feel supported in a way I hadn't experienced before. 3 weeks later, Ralph invited me to dinner at his parents' house, and I spent 2 hours trying to figure out what to wear. His mom answered the door and pulled me into a hug before I even introduced myself. His dad shook my hand and made a joke about Ralph finally bringing someone home. We sat around their dining room table eating pot roast, and his parents asked me questions about work and school and my family. His mom mentioned Ralph seemed happier than he'd been in years, and reached over to pat his hand. Ralph squeezed my hand under the table and I felt my face get hot. His dad told embarrassing stories about Ralph as a kid, and Ralph groaned but kept smiling. When we left, his mom hugged me again and whispered that I was welcome anytime. In the car, Ralph apologized if they were too much, and I told him they were perfect. I decided it was time for Ralph to meet Joyce properly, so I invited them both to lunch at a casual restaurant. Joyce arrived first and kept adjusting her napkin and checking her phone. Ralph walked in and spotted us, and I saw Joyce tense up. I introduced them again using their real names this time and made a joke about everyone being themselves. The first few minutes were awkward with lots of silence and forced small talk. Then Joyce looked directly at Ralph and apologized for the whole situation and for using him without considering his feelings. Ralph listened quietly, and then said he appreciated the apology, and that we'd all learned something from the experience. After that, the conversation got easier, and they started talking about how ridiculous the whole thing was. Joyce mentioned the sequined jumpsuit, and Ralph laughed and said he still couldn't believe I committed that hard to the bit. By the end of lunch, they were joking together, and I felt relieved that this part of the mess was finally healing. Ralph started coming over to my apartment regularly, and my cat, who normally hated everyone, immediately jumped in his lap. I took it as a good sign since she usually hid under the bed when people visited. Ralph would show up after work, and we'd cook dinner together with him chopping vegetables while I handled the actual cooking. We fell into an easy routine of making food, and then watching movies on my couch with my cat curled up between us. He learned which shows I liked and which foods my cat preferred. Sometimes we wouldn't even watch anything and just talk about our days or make plans for the weekend. Having him in my space felt natural instead of stressful, and I realized this was what a healthy relationship was supposed to feel like. 6 months after our actual first date, Ralph suggested we take a weekend trip to the mountains. We drove up on a Friday afternoon and checked into a small cabin with a view of the trees. We spent the weekend hiking and talking about what we both wanted for the future. Ralph said he could see himself staying in this area long term and asked what I thought about that. I told him I wanted to finish the vet tech program first, but I could see building a life here. We talked about moving in together eventually once I was settled in the school. We discussed what we both needed in a relationship and what our deal breakers were. Everything felt serious but not scary, because we were both being completely honest about what we wanted. On the drive home, Ralph reached over and held my hand and said he was glad we were doing this right. Joyce called me a few months later, practically screaming that her boyfriend proposed and she wanted me to be in her wedding. I said yes immediately, and she laughed and made a joke about at least this time everyone would know who everyone actually was. We met up to look at bridesmaid dresses, and she told me about the proposal and how excited she was. She said therapy helped her learn how to be in a real relationship without all the lying and hiding. I told her I was proud of her for doing the work to change. Planning the wedding together felt like our friendship was finally healing properly. We could laugh about the past without it feeling heavy or awkward. I got my acceptance letter to the veterinary technician program on a Tuesday morning and immediately called Ralph. He picked me up after work and took me to a nice restaurant to celebrate. Over dinner, he told me he was proud of how I turned a terrible situation into motivation to pursue something meaningful. He said watching me work toward this goal made him respect me even more. I told him none of this would have happened without the mess with Joyce because I never would have met him or started working at the clinic. Ralph raised his glass and said sometimes the worst situations lead to the best outcomes. We stayed at the restaurant talking about my upcoming classes and what my schedule would look like. Ralph promised to help however he could and said he believed in me completely. We stayed at the restaurant talking about my upcoming classes and what my schedule would look like. Ralph promised to help however he could and said he believed in me completely. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with a text from Corey asking if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I stared at the message for a minute before responding that coffee sounded good. We met up at a place near campus and he told me he was seeing someone new, and things were going really well. He said he was glad everything worked out for me and Ralph, and that he hoped we could all be friends now that the drama was behind us. I suggested we all get dinner together sometime, and he agreed immediately. The following Saturday, I found myself sitting in a booth at an Italian restaurant with Ralph on one side and Corey and his new girlfriend across from us. Joyce showed up a few minutes late with her boyfriend and slid into the booth next to Corey. The whole situation felt weird for about 5 minutes until someone made a joke about the breadsticks, and everyone started laughing. We spent 2 hours eating pasta and sharing stories, and by the end of the night, it felt surprisingly normal to have everyone in the same room. A month later, Ralph asked if he could meet my parents, and I agreed, even though the idea made me nervous. We drove to their house on a Sunday afternoon, and my mom opened the door before we even knocked. She hugged Ralph like she'd known him for years and pulled us both inside. My dad shook Ralph's hand and made small talk about traffic while my mom finished cooking dinner. After we ate, Ralph stood up and started clearing plates without being asked. My mom watched him carry dishes to the kitchen, and I saw her smile at me from across the table. Ralph insisted on helping with the dishes, and my mom looked like she might cry from happiness. My dad waited until Ralph was elbow deep in soapy water before saying, "At least this time I didn't have to pay someone to date me." Ralph laughed harder than anyone else in the room, and my dad clapped him on the shoulder. On our 1-year anniversary of our actual first date, Ralph picked me up and drove to the same coffee shop where I had confessed everything. We walked inside and sat at a table near the window. Ralph reached across and held my hand. He told me he was grateful I had been honest even though it was hard, because it showed him I valued truth over convenience. I squeezed his hand and told him I was grateful he gave me a second chance. We ordered coffee and sat there for an hour talking about how much had changed since that day. I started my vet tech program in September, and the coursework was harder than I expected. Ralph came over most evenings and helped me study, quizzing me on anatomy and procedures until I could recite everything from memory. One night while we were sitting on my couch surrounded by textbooks, Ralph mentioned he had been thinking about moving in together once I was settled into the program. I looked at him and realized I wanted that too. We talked about what kind of place we'd look for and how we'd split expenses. My cat jumped onto Ralph's lap during the entire conversation and refused to move, which I took as her approval of the plan. Looking back on the whole ridiculous situation, I realized that the mess I created by pretending to be someone else taught me the value of being exactly who I am. Ralph and I built something real from the ashes of a lie. My cat was healthy and acting like her normal demanding self. I found a career I actually loved instead of just stumbling through jobs I hated. Joyce and I had an honest friendship now where we could talk about real things instead of just surface-level stuff. Life got complicated and messy for a while, but we all came through it better than before. I woke up every day grateful that Ralph saw past the chaos to the real person underneath, and that I finally learned to be that person, instead of pretending to be someone else. And that's the wrap-up. I always try to sneak in a little something useful you can actually apply, not just a story to listen to. If this one sparked an idea, that's a win in my book. Hit subscribe and let's keep learning together.